Hi, guys. Okay, so this week we are getting into our first major, sort of big picture answer to this thing I'm calling the problem of uncertainty, which constitutes these two questions. What should I do when I can't be certain, and what should I believe? And on the other hand, what do we know? What is knowledge? So, broadly speaking, the infallibilist says that knowledge requires infallible belief. What does it mean for a belief to be infallible? Put it this way, um, if you know that P, then you must have a guarantee of P's truth. Or in other words, if you know that P, then it must be, in some appropriate sense, impossible for P to be false. What this means in practice is if you are looking at some belief that you have, there's something that you think is true, and you want to figure out, is this knowledge? If you can come up with some way that you might be mistaken about that, some way that it's possible for you to have this belief in the way that you have it, and yet for the thing you believe not to be true, then it can't be knowledge. Okay, so as I'm putting it here, the infallibilist's answers to our two questions. On the one hand, what should I do when I can't be certain? The answer is you should get certain. Part of what I'm taking to be part of infallibilism as I'm construing it is the idea that we can actually have this, right? So next week we'll look at skepticism, which is a view according to which, taken as an answer to this problem of uncertainty, the skeptic says you just can't be certain, and some other things. But that's next week. The kind of infallibilist we're looking at this week thinks there are things you can be certain of, that you can be genuinely certain of. There are some beliefs that we have, maybe a substantial number of them, not just like some tiny little corner of logical truths or something, such that it is in fact impossible for us to be mistaken about them. So the practical answer to something like this, what should I do when I can't be certain? You should get certain. What should I believe? Well, if you aren't certain, you should not believe anything. Second question, what do we know? What's knowledge? Knowledge is just what we can be certain of. So I've framed those things in terms of getting certain and being certain, but we can define infallibilism in slightly different terms if these things make more sense to you. So here are a few different ways of expressing, characterizing infallibilism on the one hand, and some of these are already there in the text I've put in that Canvas module that I'm reading off of. So here's one thing. In order to know that P, it must be, in some appropriate sense, impossible that P is false. Like, impossible for you. In order to know that P, you must have a guarantee that P. If you know that P must have probability 1 for you, with some appropriate kind of probability. In order to know that P, you must be certain that P, again, in some appropriate kind of certainty that isn't merely psychological, right? The infallibilist isn't just saying you have to be extremely confident of P. They're saying, you must have evidence or reasons or something like that that allows you to be justifiably certain that P. Okay, so that's sort of what infallibilism is. Next question would be, why would you ever want to be an infallibilist? What's a reason for thinking this? I mean, maybe this just seems obviously right to some of you, but for those who don't think it's obviously right, what's a reason for thinking this? Well, let's start with Descartes, because I know you've had to read the Meditations many times before now. I'm not going to make you read them again, but Descartes is usually held up as like the shining example of an infallibilist. Your required reading for this week is going to argue that just about everybody before sort of the middle of the 20th century was already an infallibilist. I find that case pretty persuasive, but we can at least say Descartes sure looks like an infallibilist. Why? Well, look at what he does in those meditations. So the first couple of meditations, he starts out by saying, I want to, I hate being wrong about stuff. I hate having all these beliefs that turn out to be false. I don't want to have that ever happen again. So I'm going to, book myself some me time in my nice hot room. I'm going to try and think through. I'm going to try and get through all of my beliefs and get rid of all the ones that even might be false. Anything that could possibly be false, I'm going to throw out. That's the method of doubt I'm adopting. If it's possible for me to doubt something in a certain clearly defined kind of way, I'm going to stop believing it, at least for purposes of this exercise. And I'm going to see how far that gets me. And by the end of the meditations, if I can start with indubitable beginnings, foundations, and build up a bunch of other stuff to believe on the basis of that, that'll all be stuff that I can be sure, I can be certain is true. I have a guarantee that it's true. Those things I'll take myself to know. If I have enough, then great. I'll go and just believe those things and try and hang on to this sort of rule. Now, I'm sure you've heard this before because you have run into the meditations in Descartes in your other modules. There is a thing that we describe as Cartesian skepticism, which is a kind of skepticism. Descartes is not a Cartesian skeptic. The Cartesian skeptic is the kind of skeptic that Descartes takes to be his opponent. So the reason why he's raising all these doubts and eliminating all these beliefs is because he wants to show that that skeptic is wrong. He wants to show, here are all these things that you can wind up believing. And by the time he gets to the end of the meditations, he does have a whole bunch of stuff that he thinks he can believe. Not everything, right? He trusts some things more than others. He says, he doesn't say, like, you can trust your senses, full stop. He doesn't say you can trust common sense, but he says clear and distinct perceptions. And, if you want to go and do some Cartesian scholarship, you can figure out what exactly it means for something to be clear and distinct. But he thinks, look, I have rock solid reasons for trusting my clear and distinct perceptions. Okay, plenty of people have doubts about how successful he is in establishing those things. That's for next week and the week after. But here's somebody who thinks I can count myself as knowing all kinds of stuff. I can satisfactorily put into practice this answer to question number 1. What should I do when I can't be certain? I should get certain. I should stick to my clear and distinct perceptions, and I have enough of those to get around. Okay. I want to spend a bit of time here arguing against a certain way of thinking about what Descartes is doing in those first 2 meditations. So the way it's often presented, and I myself present it this way sometimes, the way it's often presented, what Descartes is doing in those first 2 meditations, where he says, I'm going to sweep away anything that I even possibly could be wrong about. If it's at all possible that I believe this thing in the way that I do and it's false, no matter how likely the possibility is, no matter how marginal, if there's any possibility, I'm going to throw the thing out. That's often framed as conceding a lot to the skeptic for rhetorical purposes, right? I say, I'm going to give you all this ground. You, dear skeptic, you win on anything that I even possibly, the slightest possibility I could be wrong, you win. I'll give it up. And I'm still going to be able to build up all this stuff. I'm going to find out that God exists. I'm going to find out that there's extension in the world. Color's kind of shaky, but at least I get extension. That's great. Okay, so the framing there that I'm going to suggest we might think twice about is the idea that Descartes is doing something non-ordinary, that he is conceding a lot to the skeptic. So I'm going to lean on, for this, a book that is not among your required readings. So this is called, let me get that in front there, The Significance of Philosophical Skepticism by Barry Stroud. That's kind of visible. I'm going to give you a bit of his argument in the second chapter of that book. So he spends a bunch of time talking about Descartes and Cartesian skepticism in particular. But I'm going to read to you a bit from chapter 2. Let me switch over here to show you that and get myself back in here. So chapter 2 is called Philosophical Skepticism and Everyday Life. This is a slightly unfortunate document, the ebook that you can read through on Google Books. I'll put a link to that in on the Canvas module and in the description here on YouTube. It's kind of formatted in a way that makes it difficult to put on the screen, but I'm going to read you some of this stuff. So part of what Stroud wants to do in this chapter is argue against exactly that take that I just gave you on Descartes' project. So he wants to say, the way that Descartes' reasoning about knowledge in those first couple of meditations is the way that we, in ordinary life, reason about knowledge and reason about other people's claims to know things. So let me start with, here's a nice vivid little thing. that Stroud gives early on. He suggests, so here's one example of a diagnosis of skepticism along certain lines, goes like this. So he's going to say, some people will say, look, when Descartes treats knowledge as something that that you lack, if it's even possible for you to be wrong, then he's just changing the meaning of knowledge. That is not how we normally talk about the thing. Like, maybe you could argue for that as a legitimate definition, but, well, you'd have to argue for that. It is a change. So here's an analogy. Here's a way you could make a parallel kind of move. So suppose someone makes the quite startling announcement that there are no physicians in the city of New York. That certainly seems to go against something we all thought we knew to be true. It would be really astonishing if there were no physicians at all in a city that size. When we ask how the remarkable discovery was made and how long this deplorable state of affairs is obtained, suppose we find that the bearer of the startling news says it's true because, as he explains, what he means by physician is a person who has a medical degree and can cure any conceivable illness in less than 2 minutes. We are no longer surprised by his announcement, nor do we find that it contradicts anything we all thought we knew to be true. We find it quite believable that there's no one in the whole city who fulfills all the conditions of that particular redefinition of physician. Once we understand it as it was meant to be understood, there's nothing startling about the announcement except perhaps the form in which it was expressed. That is, that they said there are no physicians instead of saying there are no people who can cure an inconceivable illness. It does not deny what on first sight it might seem to deny, and it poses no threat to our original belief that there are thousands and thousands of physicians in New York. Okay, what's the parallel for knowledge-type cases? Descartes tells you, or the Cartesian skeptic, not Descartes, the Cartesian skeptic tells you, you don't know anything except for maybe that you are now thinking. And you say, oh my goodness, that's a surprise. Wait, we don't know anything. And the skeptic answers, yeah, because knowledge requires that you be able to rule out the possibility that there's an evil demon who's been feeding your eyes and ears with misleading hallucinations for absolutely everything for your entire life. And also every time you try to add up 2 and 2 and you get 4, that's because the demon tricked you along the way. Why? Because he wants to. I'm not saying it's true. I'm saying you can't rule it out. How do you know there's no demon? When you hear that, you think, oh, yeah, no, I know I don't have that. But I don't care. I mean, yeah, but I know, like, you remember these guys. I've been talking about the stale package of gingerbread men. I know that because, like, I can see it. And I tried one of them last night, and they are really stale. I need to finish them. I could just finish them now. No, I'm busy. But knowing this has nothing to do with ruling out the evil demon. So, like, I can hang on to the thing that I already thought, namely that I know a bunch of stuff, while conceding that I can't prove that there's no evil demon. Okay, that's the objection. So this is somebody saying something like, when you treat knowledge as requiring infallibility, that is, if your view of knowledge is infallibilist, you are redefining the concept or the word from how we ordinarily talk about it. And Stroud's going to say, doesn't look like that. So let me advance a few pages. So drawing here on a mid-20th century philosopher, J.L. Austin, he's going to give us some examples of how we ordinarily talk about knowledge. So here's an example from Austin in a paper called How Do You Know? And a paper called Other Minds, talking about some ordinary practices of talking about knowledge. So here's Stroud drawing on Austin. He says, if asked how I know there's a goldfinch in the garden, for example, I might reply by explaining how I've come to know about goldfinches or about small British birds in general, or I might explain how I came to be in a position to recognize and hence to know about the goldfinch in the garden in this particular case. This second kind of reply to the question, how do you know? The second kind where I tell you how I came to be in a position to recognize and know about the goldfinch in the garden. The second kind of reply to the question, how do you know, might be inadequate because my system of classification is wrong. What I think are goldfinches are really something else. Or my response might be challenged on the grounds that what I've said about how I know is not enough. If I said I knew it was a goldfinch by its red head, it might be objected, but that's not enough. Plenty of other birds have red heads. What you say doesn't prove it. For all you know, it may be a woodpecker. This amounts to raising a possibility compatible with everything I've said, but which, if actual, would imply that I do not know that there's a goldfinch in the garden. It therefore brings us close to the kind of objection Descartes raises against our ordinary knowledge of the world around us. Okay, I'll talk a little bit more about this example, but what I want you to do is try to pay attention in ordinary life to our ordinary practices, ordinary, I'm going to use that word a lot, our ordinary practices of objecting to ordinary knowledge claims. What Stroud's suggesting here, following Austin, is that this general strategy of, person A says, I know this thing. Person B says, how do you know that? Person A says, here are my reasons. And person B says, yeah, but those reasons don't guarantee the thing that you claim to know. How do I know it doesn't guarantee it? Because, hey, here's a story about how you could have those same reasons, but the belief is false instead of true. That shows they don't guarantee it, so you don't know it. That kind of strategy, if that kind of strategy works universally, that is, with no restriction on the kind of possibility the kind of error possibility that can undermine a knowledge claim, then infallibilism's got to be true, because then implicitly we're saying, look, any kind of error possibility means you don't know. That means you need to have none of those in order to know something. And that's just what infallibilism says. So, right, just focusing in on this example, we're imagining I say, hey, there's a goldfinch in the garden, or I say, I know there's a goldfinch in the garden. You, let's imagine, know birds better than I do, but you aren't looking out the window, so you can't just sort of look at it and say, yeah, that's a goldfinch, right? You say, how do you know it's a goldfinch? Maybe because you know I'm bad with birds, or like I'm good with birds from a different continent, and like North American goldfinches don't look the same as the things they call goldfinches over here. Just like North American robins do not look like English robins. It's kind of strange how those two things get called the same thing. They don't have that much in common. North American robins are a lot more like blackbirds, except they have like a red breast. So I guess people who were naming things thought that's the most important similarity to English birds. We'll just call that one a robin. Maybe they've forgotten what robins look like because they had to take boats. It took a long time. Anyway, okay, so I'm looking at this thing in the garden. I say, there's a goldfinch. Or I say, I know there's a goldfinch I saw. And you say, how do you know that? And I say, it had a red head. Birds with red heads, those are goldfinches. Goldfinches have red heads. I saw a bird with a red head. And you object, that's not enough. You say, you can't say it's a goldfinch just because it has a red head. Because, for example, here's another possibility. If you were looking at a woodpecker, that would be a bird with a red head. Apparently, a red head is enough for you to conclude that it's a goldfinch. If you saw a woodpecker, you would say it's a goldfinch. You'd be wrong. So you don't know that it's a goldfinch. Even if you're right, you don't know it because your reasons aren't strong enough. Because there's a possibility compatible with everything I've said, everything I've appealed to, all the reasons I've given you, but which, if actual, that is, if it were a woodpecker, would imply that I don't know there's a goldfinch in the garden. In fact, it would imply not only that I don't know it, but that it would be false that there's a goldfinch in the garden. Stroud's doing something a little bit subtle, but the difference is not important for our present purposes. Okay, I think that's an ordinary way of objecting to knowledge claims. You might disagree. I'd be happy to hear about it when we talk. But what I want you to do as you're thinking about how plausible infallibilism is, even if you already think it's plausible, I want you to think about this. Try to think about our ordinary practices of challenging people's knowledge claims. So first of all, does this kind of objection where you say, here's a possibility where you'd be wrong, does that seem ordinary? And second, and this is important, are there limits on that? So like, are there kinds of error possibilities that in ordinary talk we are not allowed to appeal to? So like if I say, let's try this. I think already the woodpecker example is a little bit funny because the woodpeckers that I know of are bigger than the goldfinches I know of. But like if somebody said, some kind of eagle or condor or something, they have red heads too. So having a red head doesn't prove it's a goldfinch. You might say, yeah, I know it's not an eagle though. Eagles are huge. There's other stuff. On the other hand, another kind of possibility you might rule out, if I say, I know this is a goldfinch, you say, how do you know? I say it has a red head, and you say, well, the simulated goldfinches in the Matrix also have red heads, so how do you know it's not a simulated goldfinch in the Matrix? Like, how do you know you're not in the Matrix? How do you know anything? Knowledge isn't possible. Come on. You might say, that doesn't feel like it undermines my knowledge claims. I don't know. I want you to pay attention to knowledge claims you can think of. Yeah. Either real ones or ones in like fiction and stories, things that have happened to you, things that have happened to other people. Let's talk about it. Bring some of those things to tutorial. Talk to you soon.